Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over the divisibility rules from 1 to 6. I will be going over the divisibility rules from 7 to 11 in a later video, but right now I'm just going to be going over from 1 to 6. Okay, so first the divisibility rules for 1. The divisibility rule for 1 is very simple. If it is an integer, it is divisible by 1, because any number you can get, any integer you can get by adding a certain amount of 1s together. For example, for 4, which is divisible by 1, you can get that by having 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So any number which is a integer, meaning that it doesn't have any decimals or fractions, is going to be divisible by 1. If you're having trouble following along, I put down to the right of you a column where I'm going to be putting down the divisibility rule and an example of a number which is divisible by the number. Great, so the divisibility rule for 2 is that if a number is even, then it is going to be divisible by 2. You can tell if a number is even by seeing if it ends in a 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8. So let's go over some examples. 14 is divisible by 2 because it ends in a 4. And 4 is one of the numbers which you can tell if it's even. 357 is not divisible by 2 because it ends in a 7, which is not even. And 4002 is divisible by 2 because it ends in a 2, which is even. Okay, so the divisibility rule for 3 is that you would add up the digits, and if the sum of the digits is divisible by 3, then the whole number is going to be divisible by 3. So let's look at a few examples. 16 is not divisible by 3. We can tell this because if we add 1 and 6, which is the digits, it gives us 7, and we know 7 is not divisible by 3. Let's look at 387. 387 gives you the sum 18, which gives you the sum 9, which you know is divisible by 3. So 387 is divisible by 3. Let's look at this number. If we add up the digits, we get 16 plus 9 plus 2, which is equal to 27. If we add 2 and 7, we get 9, which we know is divisible by 3. So we know that 26,892 is divisible by 3. Now we're going to be moving on to 4. The divisibility rule for 4 is actually the most complicated of all of the ones we've done so far. You have to take the last 2 digits of the number, so let's give the example of 326. The last 2 digits of this number is 26, and then we have to tell, is 26 divisible by 4? Since 26 is not divisible by 4, that tells us that 326 is also not divisible by 4. 40,822. The last 2 digits are 22, which also is not divisible by 4, which tells us that 40,822 is also not divisible by 4. Now let's move on to the last number, 8,126,916. Now this might look big, but it's just as simple as the other ones. You just take 16, which are the last 2 digits, and you know that 16 is divisible by 4, which tells you that 8,126,916 is also divisible by 4. Now, let's move on to the almost last one, divisibility rules for 5. The divisibility rule for 5 is really simple. All you have to do is you have to take the last digit, so in this case it would be 8, and figure out, is this number divisible by 5? Meaning, is it a 5 or is it a 0? 8 is not a 5 or a 0, so 38 is not divisible by 5. 120 ends in a 0, which is divisible by 5. So, it is divisible. Now, 484,937,225 is divisible by 5 because it ends in a 5. So, you can tell that this number is divisible by 5. Alright, we're on to the last one for part 1. So, the divisibility rule for 6 is a sort of merging of the divisibility rules for 2 and the divisibility rule for 3. Basically, to check if a number is divisible by 6, you have to check if it's divisible by both 2 and 3. So let's go over our first example of 42. So let's first check if it's divisible by 2. It ends in a 2, which is even, so we can tell, yes, it is divisible by 2. Now we have to check, is it divisible by 3? So we can remember the divisibility rule for 3 was we add up the digits, and we check if that's divisible by 3. 4 plus 2 is 6, which is divisible by 3. So we can tell, yes, it is divisible by 3, meaning 42 is divisible by 6. Now, let's move on to 896. Is it divisible by 2? Yes, it is, because 6 is even, so it is divisible by 2. And is it divisible by 3? So let's add up the numbers. We get 23, which, when we add them together again, we get 5, which is not divisible by 3, meaning that this number is not divisible by 6. Now, let's move on to 433,131. First of all, it's not divisible by 2, so that completely disqualifies it from being divisible by 6. Congratulations, you made it to the end. I'm just going to quickly go over the divisibility rules from 1 through 6 in a really quick way. Alright, so the divisibility rule for 1 was, is it an integer? The divisibility rule for 2 was, is the number even? The divisibility rule for 3 is you add up the digits, and if that is divisible by 3, then the number is divisible by 3. The divisibility rule for 4 is the last two digits divisible by 4? The divisibility rule for 5 is the last digit 0 or 5? And the divisibility rule for 6 is it 2 or 3?